Chapter 6 Montesquieu's Parti Pris. We have now certainly made some progress from the separation of powers to the equilibrium of the puissances dividing up the power, and from this apparent equilibrium to the scheme to re-establish and consecrate one among these puissances, the nobility. But we are still within Montesquieu. In this examination we have managed to move from the forestage to backstage, from our author's apparent reasons to his real reasons. But in doing so we have adopted his reasons and accepted the division of roles he proposed for us without adapting them in any way. Take Heisenman, for example. He has a notion that the problem is not juridical, but political and social. But when it comes to listing the social forces present, he rediscovers Montesquieu's own three forces: king, nobility, bourgeoisie, and goes no further. Moreover, this tripartition is not Montesquieu's alone, it is the tripartition of the whole epoch, of Voltaire, Helvetius, Diderot, and Condorcet, and of a long tradition lasting well into the 19th century and perhaps still not quite dead even today. This conviction is so manifest, this obviousness so general, that none of the parties in the 18th century, even up to the beginning of the Revolution, ever thought of revoking it. Should we therefore accept it absolutely? Can we go so straightforwardly into the categories of Montesquieu and his age and decide without argument that he very accurately distinguished the puissances, not in their combination, but in their definition, and separated them according to their natural articulations? What I mean is that we should pose ourselves a very simple question, but one which may turn everything upside down. Do Montesquieu, Politics and History 97 the categories in which the men of the 18th century thought the history they were living answer to the historical reality? In particular, is the clear distinction between the three puissances a well-founded one? Is the king really a puissance in the same sense as the nobility and the bourgeoisie? Is the king an autonomous puissance of his own, sufficiently distinct from the others not in person or powers, but in role and function, that he can really be put in the balance with the others, be circumvented and compacted with? The bourgeoisie itself, those notables of profession, la robe trade and finance, is it to that extent and in that epoch the opponent of the nobility and its opposite already detectable in the lower chamber? Montesquieu concedes it, its first theoretical victory in the campaign which was to triumph in the Revolution? To ask these questions is to call back into doubt the very convictions of the men of the 18th century and to raise the difficult problem of the nature of absolute monarchy on the one hand, of the bourgeoisie on the other, in the historical period in which Montesquieu lived and which he thinks. Now we have to admit that one idea dominated all the political literature of the 18th century, the idea that absolute monarchy was set up against the nobility, and that the king relied on the commoners to balance the power of his feudal opponents and reduce them to his mercy. The great dispute between the Romanists and the Germanists about the origins of feudalism and absolute monarchy unfolded against the background of this general conviction. Its echo can be found in many passages in The Spirit of Laws, 1 and in its last 3 books, which are hardly ever read but are devoted entirely to it, and should be read to see on which side Montesquieu really ranged himself. On the one hand the Germanists, Saint Simon, Blainvilliers, and Montesquieu, the last better informed and more nuanced, but just as firm, nostalgically evoke the age of primitive monarchy, a king elected by the nobles and a peer among his peers, as it was originally in the forests of Germany, counterposing it to monarchy become I. SL, VI, 18, X, 3, XI, 7 and 9, 14, 1 4, 17, 5, 18, 2 2, etc. 9 8 Absolute, a king fighting with and sacrificing the great to take his clerks and his allies from the commoners. On the other hand, the absolutist party, bourgeois in inspiration, the Romanists, the Abbé du Bos, that author of A Conspiracy Against the Nobility, SL, 30, IO, and target of the last books of the Spirit of Laws, and the encyclopedists, celebrate either in Louis XIV or in the enlightened despot the ideal of a prince who is wise enough to prefer the merits and titles of the hard-working bourgeoisie to the outdated pretensions of the feudal lords. These partis pris are incompatible, but the argument is the same. But we are justified in asking whether this basic conflict opposing the king to the nobility and this supposed alliance between absolute monarchy and the bourgeoisie against the feudal lords does not mask the true relation of forces. We should not conceal from ourselves the fact that contemporaries of the time lived their history while thinking it, and that their thought, still groping for scientific criteria, lacked that necessary distance which enables thought to become the critique of life. Thinking a history whose deeper springs escaped them, it was easy for them to limit their thought to the immediate categories of their historical life, most often taking political intentions for reality itself, and superficial conflicts for the basis of things. History and the perceived world are not so very different. Everyone can immediately and obviously see in history forms, structures, groups of men, tendencies and conflicts. It is to this obviousness that Montesquieu appeals in his famous statement, "There are three species of government." In order to discover their nature, it is sufficient to recollect the idea of them had by the least educated of men, SL, N, I. It is this kind of obviousness which makes visible the omnipotence of a king, nobles slaves to a court or reduced to a minimal political portion on their lands, omnipotent and mischievous intendants, upstart commoners. It is enough to have one's eyes open to see these facts, as it is enough to cf. SL, 31, 2I. Louis the Débauché, as he had no longer any confidence in the nobility, he promoted mean people, turning the nobles out of their employments at court to make room for strangers and upstarts. Montesquieu, Politics and History 99. To have one's eyes open to the world to perceive immediately forms, objects, groups and movements, this obviousness, which does without knowledge, can nonetheless lay claim to it and think that it understands what it only perceives. But the elements at least of a science are really needed to understand the deeper nature of these obviousnesses, to distinguish between the profound structures and conflicts on the one hand and the superficial ones on the other, and between the real motions and the apparent motions. Without a critique of the immediate concepts in which every epoch thinks the history it fives, we shall remain on the threshold of a true knowledge of history and a prisoner of the illusions it produces in the men who five it. I believe that in order to cast light on the ideological problems of this period, it is helpful precisely to draw on the recent achievements of historical research, and to re-examine the received notions of absolute monarchy, of its alliance with the bourgeoisie and of the nature of that bourgeoisie itself. I must content myself with very brief indications. However, I do want to say that it seems more or less certain today that the gravest danger confronting the historian of the 17th and even of the 18th century, at least of its first half, is to project onto the bourgeoisie of this period the image of the later bourgeoisie which made the revolution, and of the bourgeoisie which emerged from the revolution. The true modern bourgeoisie, which transformed the previous economic and social order from top to bottom, is the industrial bourgeoisie, with its mass production economy, concentrating entirely on profit subsequently reinvested in production. But in its generality this bourgeoisie was unknown to the 18th century. The bourgeoisie of that period was quite different. In its most advanced elements it was essentially dependent on the mercantile economy. The fact that the industrial economy emerged at a given moment from an accumulation in which the mercantile economy constituted a moment, too often gives rise to the conclusion that the mercantile economy was foreign to feudal society in principle. Nothing is more doubtful. Once we know in what sense this 100 mercantile economy then acted, we see that it was a fairly well integrated part of the feudal system itself. Mercantilism is precisely the politics and theory of this integration. All the economic activity which then seemed to constitute the vanguard, commerce, manufactures, was indeed concentrated on the state apparatus, subordinate to its profits and to its needs. 8 Manufactures were founded above all to provide the court with luxury goods, the troops with arms and the royal commerce with materials for exports, the profits from which returned to the treasury. The great navigation companies were created first and foremost to bring into the country, and always more or less to the advantage of the royal administration, spices and precious metals from overseas. In its structure the economic cycle of this period is thus orientated towards the state apparatus as its goal. And the counterpart to this orientation is the fact that the bourgeois who at one moment or another give life to these economic operations have no other economic or individual horizon than the feudal order that this state apparatus serves. On becoming rich, the merchant does not, with a few rare exceptions, invest his gains in private production, but in lands, which he buys for their title and for an entry into the nobility, in offices that are functions of the administration, which he buys so as to enjoy their revenue as a kind of rent, and in state loans, which guarantee him large profits. The aim of the bourgeois enriched by trade thus consists of directly entering the society of the nobility, by the purchase of lands or the refurbishing of a family whose daughter he marries, or of directly entering the state apparatus by the gown and offices, or of sharing in the profits of the state apparatus via rents. This is what gives this upstart bourgeoisie such a peculiar situation in the feudal state. It takes its place inside the nobility more than it fights it, and with these pretensions to enter the order it seems to be fighting, it supports it as much as it undermines it. The whole cycle of its economic activity and of the careers of its members. 3. The laws in a monarchy ought to favor all kinds of commerce consistent with the Constitution, to the end that the subjects may, without ruining themselves, be able to satisfy the continual cravings of the prince and his court. Montesquieu, Politics and History. Thus remains inscribed in the limits and structures of the feudal state. Once established, this point obviously overthrows both the classical schema of the alliance between the absolute monarchy and the bourgeoisie, and the received notion of absolute monarchy. It is therefore necessary to ask what is the nature and function of absolute monarchy, even in the conflicts which at this time oppose it to the nobility. Up to the present, two answers have been given to this question. Both abandon the idea of the king, in the grotesque caricature of the despot, as the sworn enemy of the feudal lords, replacing it by the idea that the fundamental conflict of this period did not oppose the king to the feudal lords, but the feudal lords to the rising bourgeoisie, to the people. But the agreement goes no further. For the first interpretation sees in this conflict the origin and opportunity of absolute monarchy. The confrontation and involuntary equilibrium of two antagonistic classes, each powerless to triumph over the other, and the peril in which their struggle put the entire society, gave the king the opportunity to raise himself above them as the arbiter in their rivalry, and to draw all his strength from each of their powers opposed or threatened by the power of the other. For it is this exceptional situation which explains how the king could play one class off against the other and sustain the hopes of each at the very moment he was playing the other's game. This explains why all parties in the 18th century fought over the king, both those who wanted to see him turn back towards the origin of his institutions, and restore the nobility to its rights, and those who expected his enlightenment would give the victory to bourgeois reason against privilege and arbitrariness. The fund of ideas common to both right-wing for. See even in Marx a passage on Montesquieu which still inclines towards this interpretation. For instance, in an age and in a country where royal power, aristocracy and bourgeoisie are contending for mastery and where, therefore, mastery is shared, the doctrine of the separation of powers proves to be the dominant idea and is expressed as an eternal law. Ch6. Feudal, and left-wing, bourgeois, combatants related not to dominant and shared illusions, but to the reality of an absolute monarch who, thanks to an irresoluble balance of forces, has become the real arbiter between the two opposed classes. But this interpretation has the weakness that it lapses into an idea of the bourgeoisie which, as I believe I have indicated, does not correspond to the reality. Much more illuminating is the second answer, which has acquired additional authority from Portionev's recent studies on the Fronde and popular revolts in France in the 17th and 18th centuries. 6 In this view, the thesis of the king as arbiter between two equally strong and equally powerless opposed classes is based both on an anachronism and on a mythical notion of the nature of the state. The anachronism, as I have shown, is to lend the bourgeoisie of absolute monarchy the traits of the later bourgeoisie, in order to think it even in this epoch as a class radically antagonistic to the feudal class. We know all about this. The mythical notion of the nature of the state is to imagine that a political power can be established and exercised outside classes and over them, even in the general interests of society. This dual critique leads to the following perspective: absolute monarchy is not the end, nor is its aim the end, of the regime of feudal exploitation. On the contrary, in the period under consideration it is its indispensable political apparatus. What changes with the appearance of absolute monarchy is not the regime of feudal exploitation, it is the form of its political domination. The primitive monarchy celebrated by the Germanists, the personal political privileges of feudal lords enjoying an independence that made them the king's peers, has merely given way to a centralized, dominant and absolute monarchy. This political transformation was a response to changes in the conditions of economic activity which occurred inside the feudal regime itself, and in particular to the development of the mercantile economy, the first appearance of a national market, etc. in the period under consideration. These modifications do not make any inroads into feudal exploitation. 5. Sec. Bibliography. Montesquieu, Politics and History 103 itself. And the political regime of absolute monarchy is merely the new political form required to maintain feudal domination and exploitation in a period of the development of the mercantile economy. It is hardly surprising that the advent of absolute monarchy, centralization and its epiphenomena, and even the gilded political internment camp, Versailles, had the appearances of a usurpation, an injustice and a violence directed at their class in the eyes of the individual feudal lords, stripped, even by force, of their ancient personal political prerogatives. But it is impossible not to reckon this precisely a fixed idea of theirs which masked the real from them, and a true historical misunderstanding which made them confuse these ancient personal political prerogatives with the general interests of their class. For it is only too clear that the king of absolute monarchy represented the general interests of the feudal class up to and including against the protestations of the individual feudal lords with their old-fashioned nostalgia and blindness. And if the king was an arbiter, he was not the arbiter in the conflict between the nobility and the bourgeoisie, but in conflicts within the feudal class, which he resolved in its interest. When he decided, it was, in general, never for anything but to guarantee the future of that class and of its domination, even against some of its members. But here another puissance intervenes, one which Montesquieu does not introduce into the division of power, another puissance than those that won the honors of political theory, the puissance of the masses of the people who were precisely the victims of the feudal exploitation which it was the function of the state apparatus and absolute monarchy to maintain and perpetuate. Porshnev has partly restated and partly discovered this aspect of the problem, showing that the fundamental antagonism at the time did not counterpose the absolute monarchy to the feudal lords, nor the nobility to a bourgeoisie which was for the most part integrated into the regime of feudal exploitation and profited by it, but the feudal regime itself to the masses subject to its exploitation. This fundamental conflict does not stand out like the secondary conflicts, nor does it have their theoreticians. And it does not take the 104 same forms. Between the king, the nobility and the bourgeoisie all was decided by a constant conflict of a political and ideological kind. Between the masses of the exploited, peasants subject to feudal rights, small craftsmen, shopkeepers, minor professions in the towns, on the one hand, and the feudal order and its political power on the other, it was hardly a question of theoretical disputes but rather a matter of silence or violence. It was a struggle between power and poverty, most often settled by submission and for brief periods by riots and arms. Now these starvation rebellions were very frequent in town and country throughout the 17th century in France, which had not only the peasants' wars and jacqueries of 16th century Germany, but also urban riots. These risings were ruthlessly suppressed. Now we can see what the king, the absolute power, and the state apparatus were for, and what side the famous puissances which occupied the first stage were on, until certain journée révolutionnaire of the Revolution, the first that achieved a victory, and brought a certain disorder both to theories and powers. The privilege of this fourth puissance, which so concerned the thoughts of the other three, was to be, so to speak, not represented in the political literature of the period. Not until the appearance of a poor priest from Champagne, like Montesquieu, whose testament Voltaire carefully purged of all its political sting, and then Rousseau, did this people, this common people, basse peuple, enter as a puissance, first into pamphlets, and finally into the concepts of political theory. Before this it had only an elusive existence theoretically, as it does in Montesquieu himself, who is so careful strictly to distinguish the notables from it, as it does for Voltaire and most of the encyclopedists. But this fourth puissance, this subject of non-knowledge, passion and violence, nevertheless haunts the alliances of the other three as a memory does its loss, by its censorship. The reason why this puissance is absent from the contracts that concern it is that the reason for these contracts was to make it have sent, or, what is the same thing, to consecrate its slavery. It seems to me that if we bear in mind this real nature of the Montesquieu, politics and history 105 forces invoked by Montesquieu, the king, the nobility, the bourgeoisie and the common people, some light will be cast on our general interpretation of his political choice and influence. This real analysis enables us to evade the appearances of retrospective history, and in particular the illusion of believing Montesquieu to be the herald, even the disguised herald, of the cause of the bourgeoisie which was to triumph under the Revolution. It is clear what the famous lower chamber, already so well framed in the project of an English-style constitution, Ch6 represents, the share offered to a bourgeoisie which was seeking its place in the feudal order and, finding it there, hardly dreamt of threatening that order any further. This perspective also enables us to judge at their real historical value the liberal reforms for which Montesquieu set himself up as spokesman, the reform of penal legislation, the critique of war, etc. They were so little related to the future triumphs of the bourgeoisie that the very same Montesquieu who reckoned torture inhuman intended that the nobles should have their own class tribunal in every matter, the upper chamber. What has made it look as if Montesquieu belonged to the party of the bourgeoisie seems to me rather to have been conceived by him partly as common-sense proposals in which he had the public courage of his convictions, partly as a rather skillful way precisely of bringing the bourgeoisie round to his cause and swelling the feudal opposition with the contribution of the discontents of this bourgeoisie, which presupposes, if not a clear vision, at least a fairly real sense of the objectives of this bourgeoisie. But this analysis also enables us to understand the paradox of Ch6. England is at present the freest country there is in the world. But if the lower house gains the upper hand, its power would be unlimited and dangerous. Instead, at present unlimited power is invested in the king and parliament, and the executive power, puissance, in the king, whose power is limited. Cf. Also the instructive example of primitive monarchies, the people there were the legislative puissance, SL, XI, II. But as soon as the people got the legislative power into their hands, they might, as they everywhere did, upon the very least caprice, subvert the regal authority, ibid. That is because, in these monarchies of heroic Greece, there was not yet any body of nobles. The representation of the people, even by notables, was thus not balanced within the legislature by the representation of the nobility. Ch6 Montesquieu's posterity. For this right-wing opponent served all the left-wing opponents for the rest of the century, before providing weapons and future history for all reactionaries. Of course, in the most acute period of the Revolution, Montesquieu disappeared. Robespierre speaks very harshly of the division of powers. We can hear the disciple of Rousseau confronting a situation in which theories could be judged. But it remains the case that the whole pre-revolutionary period was acted out very largely in terms of Montesquieu's themes, and this feudal enemy of despotism became the hero of all the opponents of the established order. By a unique historical volte-face, a man who looked towards the past seemed to open the door to the future. I believe that this paradox pertains above all to the anachronistic character of Montesquieu's position. It is because he pleaded the cause of an outdated order that he set himself up as an opponent of a political order which others were to make outdated. With due allowance, his thought is like the revolt of the nobility which preceded the revolution, and which Mythus argues precipitated it. Montesquieu himself merely wanted to re-establish a threatened nobility in its outdated rights. But he thought the threat came from the king. In fact, taking sides against the king's absolute power, he lent his hand to the undermining of the state apparatus which was the nobility's only rampart. His contemporaries made no mistake about this when, like Helvetius, they reckoned him too feudal, and yet they conscripted him in their battles. What does it matter where the blows come from so long as they strike the same point? And if it is true that this revolutionary posterity of Montesquieu's is a misunderstanding, that misunderstanding must nonetheless be given its due. It was merely the truth of an earlier misunderstanding, the misunderstanding that had projected Montesquieu into right-wing opposition at a time when it no longer had any meaning. 7. Reflections Morales, CXLV 2. Cf. Also his letters to Montesquieu and Sorin. Conclusion. And if I should close by returning to my first words, let me say of this man who set out alone and truly discovered the new lands of history, that nevertheless his own notion was always to return home. The conquered land he salutes on his last page, as I pretended to forget, was the land of return. Such a long route to come back home. To old-fashioned ideas after so many new ideas. To the past after so much future. As if this traveler, having set out for distant lands, and spent many years in the unknown, believed on returning home that time had stood still. But he had broken the trail. Bibliography works by Montesquieu in French and English. Herve completes, 2 vols, ed. Arago Kalos, Play d'Eden, Paris, I 949-51 de Respert de Lois, ed. G. T. Rousset, Classiques Gmr, Paris, 1964. The Spirit of Laws, translated by Th. Almazen-Ugent, revised by J. V. Pritchard, Encyclopaedia Britannica, Chicago, 1952. Lettres Persons, ed. Jacques Roger, Garnier Flammarion, Paris, 1964. Persian Letters, translated by C. J. Betts, Penguin Classics, Harmondsworth, 1973. Considerations sur les causes de la grandeur des Romains et de leur décadence, ed. Aerd, Garnier Flammarion, Paris, 1969. Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline, translated with notes and introduction by David Lowenthal, Celia Macmillan, N.E. York and L. London, 1965. Works on Montesquieu. Individual authors H. Henri Barcozin, Montesquieu, C'est idée et c'est œuvre d'après les papiers de la Bride. Pierre-François Barrière, Un grand provincial, Charles Louis de Secunda, Baron de la Bride de Montesquieu. Élie Carcassonne, Montesquieu et le problème de la Constitution française au XXe siècle. Ernst Cassirer, The Philosophy of the Enlightenment, translated by Fritz C. A. K. Eln and James P. Petgrove. Sergio Cotta, Montesquieu et la science de la société. Joseph D. Edu, Montesquieu et la tradition politique anglaise en France. Les sources anglaises de l'esprit de Lois. Montesquieu, Politics and History Iogdiano di Elbo, Montesquieu, Le Domaine politique juridique, Émile Durkheim, Montesquieu and Rousseau, Forerunners of Sociology, translated by R. M. Mannheim. Charles Eisenman, L'Esprit de Lois et la séparation des pouvoirs, Mélanges Arcade de Malberg, pages 163–92. Bernard Giroethussin, Montesquieu, Introduction to a Selection of Texts in the collection Les Classiques de la Liberté. Paul Hazard, European Thought in the 18th Century, translated by J. Louis M. A. M. Maxime Leroy, Histoire des socials en France, / de Montesquieu à Robespierre. Boris Fedorovitch Porshnev, Jean Meslier et les sources populaires de ces idées, Address to the Rami Congress, 1955, French edition by the Académie of the Sciences of the USSR. Boris Fedorovitch Porshnev, Les Événements populaires en France de 1623 à 1648, translated by Renata, revised Robert M. Andrew, École pratique des hautes études, Centre de recherches historiques étrangères, No. 4. On Porshnev, see La Pensée Nos. 32, 40 and 41. Charles Saint-Nobos, La séparation des pouvoirs, in Études de politique et d'histoire, ed. J. Leducaux. Jean Starobinsky, Montesquieu par lui-même. Charles Edward Vaughan, Studies in the History of Political Philosophy Before and After Rousseau ed. A. G. Little, Volume 1. Enrico Vidal, Saggio sul Montesquieu, con particolare riguardo alla sua concezione dell'uomo del diritto e della politica. Collective Works Reviewed de Métaphysique et de Morale, Special Number of October 1939 on M. Montesquieu. M. Montesquieu, Sa pensée politique et constitutionnelle, recueil sire du bicentenaire de Esprit des lois. Bulletin de droit slovaque, bicentenary of Montesquieu's death, in French. Octet Stuckingers Montesquieu. Part 2 Rousseau,